Okay, it's quadratic equation time. So here's your quadratic equation. You've seen it before, I'm sure. You do have to memorize it for your exam. Of course, your quiz, that's at your own discretion, but for your exam, it will not be provided for you. You will have to know it. The first thing I want to point out about the quadratic equation is it has to be in standard form first. Standard form means your powers are descending and it's set equal to 0. And your quadratic equation is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, so here's our first one. We want to put this in standard form first, which means that we're going to move this 1 over. When I move the 1 over, it becomes positive, and this is what it looks like. It is now in standard form. Okay, a is the number in front of x. B is the number in front of, let me say that again. A is the number in front of x squared. B is the number in front of x, and C is your constant. So for this particular problem, A is 2, B is negative 6, and C is 1. Your quadratic formula looks like this. I'm going to put my A and my B and my C into this function. So here we go. B is a negative 6. So you have the negative of negative 6 plus or minus the square root. B is negative 6, so that's negative 6 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2a. So take a moment to look at all of those different terms. Of course, if you are in a regular class, you could simplify as you go. You don't have to write every step out. Simplifying it, 2 negatives would make a positive 6 here on the front, plus or minus the square root of 36 minus 8 all over 4. Okay. 36 minus 8 would be 28. Now, that's not your answer. I'm going to come over here to the side, and we're going to simplify the square root of 28 back from previous objectives in this course. The square number that goes into 28 is 4. When I simplify this, the square root of 4 would come out, and this simplification here would be 2 square roots of 7. So what I'm going to get here is 6 plus or minus 2 square roots of 7 all over 4. Now that's where the 2 square roots of 7 came. You had to simplify that radical. But now it's going to simplify again because all of the terms contain a factor of 2. Now you can either break it up or factor it. There's lots of different ways you can simplify it, but it is going to simplify a little bit further. Now the way I do it is I factor it. In the top, I notice they each have a 2 coefficient or a 2 power. So I'm going to take a 2 out, and that leaves me with 3 plus or minus 1 square root of 7 all over 4. Okay, I'll scoot it up just a little. So when I get ready to reduce this one, a 2 and a 4 reduce into a 1 and a 2. So my answer would be 3 plus or minus the square root of 7 all over 2. And that's how it would look. There are other ways to reduce this down. You're welcome to use a different way, but that's what we're looking for there. Okay. little side note for this one. The imaginary unit I, we're going off on a little bit of a tangent. The imaginary unit I is defined as I equals the square root of a negative 1. Now what you need to know about that is this, if a square root has a negative in it, remember it's not a real number. We talked about that earlier. But the way that we simplify it is it's going to be an I number. So the way that you can look at this first one, just thinking it all the way out for a minute, is this 49 right here can be broken into this negative 1 times 49. So if you simplify that, you'd have the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 49. Well, I know that the square root of 49 is 7. Well, I also know now that the square root of negative 1 is I. So this answer here would be 7I. Now you do not have to work it that way at all, but I just wanted to show you where the I comes from. So in other words, if you have a square root, everything on my list isn't square, but if you have a square root of a negative, it's going to have an I answer. So the square root of negative 64, that would be 8I. And skipping one, the square root of negative 25 would be 5I. Now let's go ahead and get the bottom ones on the page. We'll come back to 27. This next one, the cubed root of negative 8, the cubed root of negative 8 is actually negative 2. It is not a square. Now for our purposes, we will only have i's under square roots. So an odd root, remember, you can take the negative of an, you can have a odd radical of a negative number. So this negative 2 is a good answer. It's not I because it's not a square root. Okay, your last answer here at the bottom is just plain 3. It's not an I either because the square root of a positive number is just a regular number. The only time you're going to have an I is if you have a negative number. Okay, so let's run back up and grab the 27 really fast. First of all, it has a negative with it, but you also have to see what square number goes into it. So I can break this down into a negative 1 and a 9 and a 3. Okay, the square root of negative 1 is I. And the square root of 9 is 3 on the outside. And this 3 right here is left underneath. And that's how that one would look. Now you'll say, why do we go off on this tangent in the middle of the quadratic formula? And the reason for that is that you may have I answers inside the quadratic formula when you simplify that radical. So here we go with that type. It's the last one of this section. I ask you to simplify this, or solve this, using the quadratic formula. It is already in standard form. Here is my understood A, which we know is a 1. Here is my B. Here is my C. All right. So let's plug in. X equals the negative of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. Look over those and make sure that makes sense. Then we'll simplify. 2 negatives make a positive 2. This would be 4 minus 8 all over 2. Okay, 4 minus 8 is actually a negative 4 over 2. Now, let's go over here to the side for just a second. In this problem, I'm asking you to simplify the square root of negative 4. Okay, well, it's a square root and a negative, so we know it's going to be an I value. This would actually be 2I. Get it up a little. So simplifying this, we get 2 plus or minus 2i over 2. So that's where the I might come in. It's the only time this semester you'll see the I, but that's where it might come in. So when I get ready to simplify this one, I simplify it by factoring. Across the top, I say they both have a common factor of 2. So if I pull that out, it leaves me with 1 as a placeholder, plus or minus 1i, and that's over 2. And the 2's cancel out, and your final answer would be 1 plus or minus 1i. Okay, so what I'll say about this particular section is I picked the hardest possible quadratic formula ones I could do. All the ones you see won't be quite as bad as this.